A Picture Book of Paul Revere by David A. Adler. Paul Revere was born in a small, crowded house on Fish Street near the edge of Boston Harbor. He was the son of Paul and Deborah Revere, the second of their 9 children. He was born on New Year's Day, 1735. Paul learned his ABCs at an infant school, where he also learned to say please and thank you and other rules of good manners. Then, when he was 7 or 8, he went to North Riding, an all-boys school. There he learned to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. At 13, Paul Revere left school to work in his father's shop. His father was a silversmith. When Paul was 15, he and 6 other boys formed a society to ring the 8 large bells in the steeple of Christ Church. The bells were said to have the sweetest sound of any in the American colonies. Paul Revere's father died in 1754. Paul was 19. Since he was the oldest son, it was his job to support his mother, sisters, and brothers. He worked in his father's silversmith shop with his younger brother Thomas. During Paul's childhood, Massachusetts was one of the 13 American colonies controlled by Great Britain. To the north and west was territory controlled by France. Beginning in 1689, there were battles along the borders between the British and the French called the French and Indian Wars. Native Americans fought for both sides. In February 1756, Paul Revere joined a Massachusetts regiment to fight the French. They marched to Fort William Henry at Lake George, New York. Paul Revere's regiment fought minor battles and had no real victories. More soldiers died from disease than from fighting. In November 1756, the surviving soldiers, including Paul Revere, were sent home. Paul went back to work in his shop. He was an excellent silversmith and was busy 6 days a week making silver teapots, punch bowls, earrings, shoe buckles, clock faces, baby rattles, whistles, dog collars, and even a chain for someone's pet squirrel. On Sundays, he went to church. One summer evening, shortly after his wife died, Paul met Rachel Walker. He was hurrying home to care for his children, and Rachel came to help. Rachel Walker was a kind, capable woman. Paul called her his dear girl. They married on September 23, 1773, and they too had 8 children. 3 of the children died young. With so many children, Paul Revere had to be sure he could always earn a living. Only wealthy people could afford to buy things made of silver, so Paul learned other trades. He worked as a goldsmith. He learned to clean real teeth and make false ones. He engraved copper plates and printed pictures and business cards fixed with umbrellas and made eyeglasses. Paul Revere was busy with his work and family. Beginning in the 1760s, he busied himself with politics too. Paul joined the Sons of Liberty, a society of Americans who were against British rule in the colonies. By 1763, the war with France had ended, but there were still British soldiers in the colonies. In March 1765, to pay for the soldiers, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was a tax on newspapers and other printed matter. The colonies had no representatives in the British Parliament, so they felt they should not be taxed. No taxation without representation, they said. The Sons of Liberty led protests against the Stamp Act. In 1766, Britain ended the Stamp Act, but the next year, the British Parliament passed the Townshend Act, taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. On March 5, 1770, Britain ended those taxes to all except for a tax on tea. On that same day on King Street in Boston, there was a fight with British soldiers. A group of colonists threw snowballs, ice, wood, and coal at them. They shouted at the soldiers and called them lobsters and bloody backs because of their red uniforms. There was a fight and some soldiers fired their guns. 5 colonists, 4 men, and 1 boy were killed in what was later called the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere made an engraving of the massacre where the soldiers all in line firing their guns at peaceful citizens. It was certainly not a true picture of what happened, but Paul Revere wanted to stir up hatred for the British, and he did. Late in 1773, 3 British ships loaded with tea sailed into Boston Harbor. Many of the people of Boston wouldn't pay the tax and they wouldn't drink the tea. On December 16, 1773, a large group of Bostonians disguised themselves as Native Americans. They divided into 3 groups, one led by Paul Revere, and boarded the ships. They broke open the 342 chests of tea and dumped them in the water. On May 10, 1774, 5,000 British soldiers arrived in Boston to close the harbor. It would remain closed until the people of Boston agreed to pay for the tea. They never did. The soldiers stayed in Boston. Paul Revere and a committee of others who wanted independence from Great Britain spied on them. In mid-April 1775, hundreds of British soldiers began getting ready for battle. On Tuesday, April 18th, Paul Revere learned that the British British were about to attack American soldiers called Minutemen in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. That night, Paul Revere and William Dawes rode to warn the Americans. Paul Revere didn't know if the British were coming by land or by sea. He told a man named Robert Newman to light one lantern in the spire of Christ Church if the enemy were coming by land, two if the enemy was coming by sea. Paul Revere left Boston by crossing the Charles River. William Dawes left through the town gate. They met at Lexington and warned their countrymen there. Samuel Prescott joined them. Then on their way to Concord, Paul Revere was caught by British officers. The British took away his horse, but they didn't harm him. William Dawes rode off in such a hurry that he fell off his horse. Only Samuel Prescott got through to warn the Americans in Concord. Early the next morning at Lexington, shots were fired. The fight for independence of the American colonies, the Revolutionary War, had begun. On July 4, 1776, representatives of the 13 colonies at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia approved the Declaration of Independence. It declared that the 13 colonies were free and independent states, no longer ruled by the British king or parliament. After the war, Paul Revere went back to work as a silversmith. He made large bells that hang in church steeples. He sold playing cards, sealing wax, wallpaper, and cloth. He worked in copper, too, making parts for ships and setting up a rolling mill to make copper sheets to cover the bottom of American warships. As Paul grew older, he was surrounded by his grandchildren and then his great-grandchildren. He told them often of his adventures before and during the American Revolution. Paul Revere died on May 10, 1818, after a long illness. He had many talents, but mostly he is remembered as an American patriot who helped his country win its independence.